Welcome to a new vision of reality, TSK for the 21st century, our new series on the time-space knowledge vision. TSK starts from the radical suggestion that deep, open-ended, sustained inquiry into time, space, and knowledge as fundamental facets or elements of our being can have a profoundly transformative impact on our ways of being and knowing in the world. Many in our time, as we are moving into the third decade of the 21st century, feel that we're caught up rather surprisingly in various crises of meaning and sense-making. And I've long felt that TSK is powerfully resonant with and relevant to the various integral, metamodern, and other communities attempting to address these crises. So I wanted to open up a series where we could explore TSK retrospectively, considering its origins and intentions, and prospectively, in light of what wisdom and ways of working it might offer us going forward. For the 9th episode of A New Vision of Reality, I'm happy to be joined by Michael Gray, a novelist and short story writer, and a TSK practitioner for over 3 decades. Well, welcome, Michael. It's nice to be with you here. We've had a few meetings in the past at some TSK retreats, and we took part in a TSK teacher training, but didn't have much of a chance to really go into a long, in-depth conversation. So I'm looking forward to our exploration today. So welcome.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you for inviting me to talk with you.
Yes, I wanted to just start out and ask you, what's your TSK story? How did you first discover it and get involved in it?
Unfortunately, I do have a TSK story because TSK alerts us to the fact that we tend to live inside our stories and it becomes a kind of confining bubble and we don't see anything outside of it because we're following the storyline. But maybe I can sort of talk and look out at the sort of rumors of light coming in from outside the egg in which I live. So it was sort of in the mid-'80s that the marriage that brought me to this country, because I'm a Canadian and 40 some years later, I'm still a Canadian, but I've lived here and I've started a family and have a family. That first wife got tired and moved on. And as is often the case when you feel you're an incompleted person, which seems to be my chronic condition, that being dumped is better than dumping somebody. So I was free to go my own way and start my own life or resume a life without sort of any terrible guilt or sense of remorse about that I abandoned an existing situation. So one day somebody who I think was probably a co-worker of my ex-wife, this was like in the mid-'80s, we were talking on the street corner and she handed over a little book called Skillful Means and said, this isn't doing anything for me, but it reminds me of how you talk. She handed it over and I looked at it, and when I delved into it, I really found it was like it sort of deeply discerned a lifelong sense of that I didn't belong in this world. I was holding back. I wasn't, not so much that I wasn't being treated right, but that I wasn't being noticed and my sort of qualities weren't being used. And then this book sort of pointed out that work is an opportunity to really, it's very rich in possibility of delving into why you're holding back from life, not just work. And I discovered that I was sort of arrogant and thought I was better than the situations I was in, and it's sort of like, I don't know, I might use the phrase "saved my life" and several times in this interview, but that book did, and I continued to read it for the 7 years that I had that job at the university. But because it so spoke to me, I started looking at other books by Tarthang Tulku, and I found several, like gesture of balance. But time-space knowledge became what I did every morning for most of the year, getting up at 4 in the morning and sitting on this porch of this little sort of quirky place in the South Valley of Albuquerque, across the river, which was Hispanic and poorer, and just sort of, I guess I'd had some interest in philosophy before, but it really just the series of 35 exercises. I've never done that since, but I worked through them all, and I read the text, and it just seemed to speak to me about another possibility for the world, another way of viewing the most sort of ordinary features of life under the name time and space and knowledge. And all the books in the TSK series, and I've read them all, they seem to sort of like take two approaches. One is it points out how our society and almost all of us have sort of settled for a stunted view of time that's like a treadmill or like a speeding truck going down a hill with no brakes, and space is like just crowded with things, and we want to get more of them, and then when we get too many of them, they hem in our freedom to move and to notice anything, and then knowledge is like the third element. That was perhaps the final realization that knowledge is everywhere. It's like it's not something that life may require us to acquire certain skills and knowledge in order to get what we want, in order to have a place in the world. But knowledge really has a deeper kind of role in our cosmos and in our lives, where it's sort of guiding everything and kind of filling everything. And so just a glimpse that time could be more alive, and I didn't have to feel cornered into some little prison of a moment, fearing the future and regretting the past. And then with space, I didn't have to feel like I was hemmed in by the concepts and the constructs that sort of made up my life. And then I guess knowledge was the one that was the most revolutionary insight, that I could relax and something, if not me personally, always knows. It knows, and it's offering up kind of not only insights, but a kind of world that you can live in that's sort of leaning toward us. And so I think you just start off by asking me, what is my TSK story? Well, that was the beginning in the mid-'80s, and it just hugely benefited my life there. And I would say for a while in an intense way. And I think even now I feel like it's changed how I view my life and the context in which my life is unfolding. And I owe and sometimes feel the gratitude gratitude for having encountered that vision.
It already comes through in how you're speaking here, but I've come to know you as quite a sensitive and poetic writer. How did your sensitivity manifest as you were growing up? And do you see it connected now to your spiritual interests and spiritual life? Any maybe experiences that you could share, or questions that were guiding you from a younger age?
So the it was that might be guiding me starting, is that like insight, creativity? Could you define that again?
Yeah, basically, just because of your, I think, sensitive already seems to me, I'm being a little presumptuous, but seems to me already sensitive mode of engagement with the world that I think shows up very clearly to me in your writings, but also in the way you're speaking here. I just wondered if even early on that showed up in the form of any experiences or any special kind of deeper probing questions that might have guided you as you were younger, and connected to your spiritual life.
You probably would rather I just don't say no right now, right? You want me to
You
explore
could definitely
that?
say no. I've had that.
Well, one of the things that was another tremendous gift, and that happened in a 6-month retreat I took after encountering TSK in the very early 90s, was that I had developed a sense of my past and my childhood as being kind of a listless, kind of mistaken sort of retreat from life, a holding back. So I don't have a lot of sense of, I had this sort of burgeoning creativity, yearning to get out. Perhaps what I'm most grateful for is that I was sometimes considered a ringleader among my pals. Like if we sort of bothered some elderly neighbor who was probably much younger than I am now, I would be the one he would shake his fist at me and say, "You're the ringleader. Guys, you kids get out of here." And so that's something I look back at with gratitude, that I always sort of felt I had a society, I had a sort of a group of friends, I had a stable world I was living in. And I didn't read, I didn't write. And I really started reading when this man who was married to a childhood friend of my mother's came into the suburb of the west end of Montreal Island where we were living. And this man sort of took me under his wing because of his own loneliness, I guess, and the fact that the Second World War had sort of closed all kinds of doors for him, including the equivalent of the McCarthy era in Canada, where the RCMP came to his door and said, "You can't do international news anymore. You can't be a commentator on international radio for the CBC." And he sort of poured into me a rather bitter view of what had happened to the world after the Second World War. And he just felt that the world had lost its way and that the tremendous sacrifices of that Second World War, society had forgotten to feel grateful for the people who had made a new beginning possible. But it had a sort of strange influence on me. He also told me that everything he was telling me was private. So he would tell me about his feelings about the world and about what it was like in Germany during the Third Reich, when he was on the good side, I'm pretty sure, because he was actually, I don't know, maybe a freedom fighter would be not quite it, but he was like but and he gave me all these titles to read that were like way beyond my age, especially as somebody who had really not gone very further than See Spot Run. It was like some books that led me into Western literature and philosophy, and I branched off from there and started reading Kafka and Dostoevsky, and all at a pretty young age. It never occurred to me to write, but it sort of filled me with a sense of, I don't know, being kind of like a misfit, not quite belonging in my milieu, helped along by the fact that he didn't want me to talk to any of my pals about this other world, So I was living like two different lives in a way, which can be rich material for writing about later. And the stories I started writing when I was in my 20s, which got published in a little magazine called Antigonus Review out of Simon Fraser University. They published 5 of my stories. When I asked my mother if my father had ever read them, I guess he had, because what she said was that he wondered why I was so negative. And it's true. I was negative, but I always felt, and I could connect this to Tarthang Tulku's writing in a way, that I was critiquing my own tendencies to turn aside from life, to sort of be obsessive about things. And so I would always have a protagonist who got what they wished for, and it was the most horrible thing. So I guess I did one about somebody taking this walk late at night, and he looks up to the place he used to live, and then he sees somebody who looks a lot like him beckoning him to come up to the third floor apartment. And there, when he walks in, he suddenly is inhabiting the body of this younger version of himself. And it's very clear that's the last thing anybody would want, to be in a sort of ushered back with what you know to the old situations that you faced when you were younger. And I guess I've written a sci-fi novel since then where I keep that sort of, it's almost like a cautionary or just a plain, simple sort of sense that our world has taken a bad tack. And then explore the consequences of having forgotten what it means to be a human being, and responsibility for the world. And I've always tended to write that. So I guess it wasn't until my 20s that I really wrote anything, but then I went straight for those themes. And the reason I mention Rinpoche or Tarthang Tulku is his TSK books seem to do that. They critique experience as his readers know it, and that's definitely true of me. And then sort of parses out the consequences of feeling you're stuck in a time that's not going anywhere, and the present moment just keeps dropping off this cliff into an unreachable past. And then you get these little droplets of new moments coming in from behind this screen that you can't contact. And it's such a lonely sentencing into a kind of a little sort of like platform of time where if you can't feel how something more like a river or like a mist or something more oceanic is running through it all, and we're just sort of looking through a particular window, but it is all connected. And I think our world is sort of like is living that story out to a very large extent. And so to be delivered from that by whatever way sort of appears into our life is a real blessing. And I feel I received that blessing from the time-space knowledge vision decades ago.
In asking you about what I see as a sensitive nature in you in your childhood, I want to say that I wasn't anticipating necessarily any sparkling spiritual moments of precociousness in your youth, but I kind of identify with you because I was such a child, and for me there was a lot of suffering involved in it. There was a lot of loneliness. There was a lot of sense of being a misfit in the world and having small circles that I moved in, but not any, I think, sense of connection to a larger, meaningful whole that made sense to me. A lot of things didn't make sense to me. And I think I started writing a few years earlier than you. First, I started out just drawing, but mostly I was in my mind and in my imagination. And my earliest stories were very horrible. They were usually about, some of the worst things that could happen to people, and madness and horrific, monstrous encounters and things like that. But to me, it was, I guess, without consciously knowing it, it was a working through of kind of the darker shadow impulses of the personality and maybe some of the frustrations of life. I'm not certain. There was a fascination with, I think, the fragility of all of our constructs and worlds. And the stories kind of explored ways that those things can come undone, or the strange and the unexpected can erupt into the ordinary. And I think so. I just felt a kind of kinship, possibly with your own childhood and past, and that was what was behind my question there.
I wonder if you, like, I just explained my turn to the dark side as being a cautionary tale, like a sort of a deliberate exploration of why you shouldn't encourage certain tendencies in yourself or entertain any false hopes about receiving consequences that you haven't earned in how you live. I always felt I was doing that. I'm not sure that I ever read straight horror stories, but I did sort of write. My early stories were always sort of like psychological nightmares of, under the guise of some lost, lonely person trying to find a mentor in one of them, another one like reconnecting with his past because he somehow doesn't like the direction his life has gone. And I always felt, without being able to live it, that I was exploring that. I was exploring in order to learn another way and avoid those sort of pitfalls. I was writing about why I or nobody wants to do that. But then, since you've brought up my writing, there was a point after I published these stories when I just suddenly stopped writing. And the reason was that I needed to work on my life. And the way I put it to myself is I don't need to be working on surrogate make-believe realities when my own lived life is sort of not the way I want it to be. So I didn't write for a couple of decades until this long retreat that I mentioned in the early 90s that allowed me to reconnect to my past as being richer than I had represented it in my mind. And along with that, I discovered that the person I've been, these sort of different versions of myself that I had sort of put a blanket over and didn't see anymore, had actually weathered, sort of changes in my life and disappointments, and somehow I had got out the other end and started living another cycle of life. And at the end of that retreat, the main teacher, Barry Sheever, sort of encouraged me to. It wasn't even an overt encouragement. But I remember his remark saying that if I could write like you, I sure would be writing. And sort of that connected in my mind with a sort of new awareness that I had allies in my own past. It wasn't just this sort of a uninteresting person who just had sort of stumbled through life without any illumination or any sort of courage. That there was courage there and resourcefulness, and so as soon as I got finished that retreat, I started writing 2 novels. Eventually, went on to a memoir, and I don't know if the 20-year hiatus allowed me to get some experiences that were worth writing about or new perspectives. It's easy to say that. In a way, I'm obliged to say that about my life as a whole, that even though I can see I weathered things and my life was a more interesting journey than I had learned to think of it as, I do have a sense that I wasted an awful lot of time not reading, not thinking, not exploring, not believing myself capable of exploring. So it's easy then to make the story that, something that's not really a story is that whenever something happens that you feel grateful for, it deserves your wholehearted gratitude. There's no need to say, well, I wish I'd had this earlier. It's really, who understands our life and what we're doing here and what our experiences and our false desire to control them, what it really all represents in terms of what it means to be a human being in time and hoping to develop a more intimate relationship with knowing, with the knowing capacity that we clearly have, and that the whole universe seems full of, brimming with, you could say.
Hmm.
Hmm. Hmm. I haven't made you speechless.
That's a good place to be.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about, some early impulses that I had when I was young towards the very alien. I wanted to seek out cultures, whether it was through science fiction or fantasy or through anthropology, to try to expose myself to the very alien and to learn languages that were very, very different from our own. I think there was a desire to see if there's a way to organize all this differently. The way that the world showed up and held together for me and my people. Is this the way it has to be? And so I think there was this early impulse towards exploring those things, and in encountering that kind of difference, having reflected back to me the edges of my own assumptions. So I can see in TSK, which is basically a path of inquiry that operates by reflecting back to you the limitations of your own assumptions, a resonance there. How does that land for you? Was there anything like that in your own exploration?
In my life, what I've become aware of is when those assumptions run out, when they're drained of life, when something happens, whether it's an event or whether it's the collapse of the ability to sort of face the future, that's when I notice that something would show up, and the language I would use would be a moment of grace, kind of breaking through from something that I wasn't able to call upon, but it just shows up. There was a time in Montreal when my sense of myself and my life in Montreal, which I'd been the only place I'd really lived either as an adult or as an adolescent, just stopped being nourishing, and I didn't like myself in it. And it may have had something to do with the friend who hung himself back then. One of my two best friends just ended his life. And I think it sort of sunk in, and I didn't deal with it. And so then suddenly I gave up my job, I gave up my apartment, I said goodbye to everybody. And there was some really delicate moments there where I definitely contemplated not continuing to live. But I headed off to the east, the maritime provinces, and then the next summer I headed off to the west, and I basically felt like reconstructed my life in terms of I felt I was this office drone with no other skills and no other sort of capacity to interact with the culture in which I had been born. And so just getting calluses in my hands and towing tractors and picking tobacco and pitching bales and working in an open pit copper mine, it gave me a sense of self that was more robust and more confident in life. But along the way, the one I just mentioned when I felt suicidal, and then another really a year later, when the summer jobs had run out and I just had this panic attack again, it's like a moment of grace came to me with the thought that this is where I wanted to be. I may not know what comes next, but this is what I really was yearning for, this open-endedness, when I felt this sort of unspeakable sameness of every day in an office in Montreal. So I don't know if they have to be negative like that, but for me, they tended to have been something fell apart in my faith in the world and the future, or in myself, my own capacity to meet it. And then I sort of, I think I was pretty good for decades. And then, I know I've mentioned to you this before, but so you know that my son died a little over 2 years ago, and he chose to take his own life. And really, drinking too much, and his body was falling apart. And so when he actually did it, I think we already mentioned the stories we tell. 100 different stories popped into my mind, that I'm to blame, or he was suffering for so long, or it was his decision. But I was already writing a book that was meant to be sort of like a song of gratitude for the TSK vision and a few other spiritual paths. And then I realized when he died that I needed something like that, but that book wasn't, I didn't deserve to write that book, because my own spiritual path had collapsed. It had proved completely unable to do what I would have most wished it to do to help my son want to live. And there's many ways of looking at that. Everybody makes their own choice, and everybody has their own loneliness. But for 2 years, I then rewrote that book that was really looking for how a spiritual path, like a phoenix, could slowly sort of resurrect in my life, and when I most needed it myself personally. So I'm sorry, I've forgotten whether you were talking about the element of being surprised by grace or writing in particular, but that's all mixed up in my mind now. And writing, for years I worked with nonprofits, and I founded one, and so that was like my attempt to manifest what I read mainly in Buddhism about compassion and wisdom having to go together like the two wings of a bird. And I knew I learned from that. Then something darker came in, like another kind of bird flew into my life. And I couldn't just happily draw on any sort of insight, any tendency of how I could verbalize it. But I would say eventually, during that period of time, although there was another book, called Caring, that was the one that I needed to rely on most heavily for certainly the first year after he died. But I've begun to realize that time and space and knowledge, it's not just wisdom and compassion that are our best friends when we need them, but a time that can't be shut down because of something terrible happening in a particular moment, and a space that's just open to something other than our futile desires to control and talk our way around impermanence just because nothing dreadful is happening. And a kind of knowing that's willing to and is able to draw upon something beyond our own really evident lack of ability to have created outcomes we wanted to create. So I would say that vision that we're talking about now, the time, space, knowledge vision, was there for me all along, and now I can appreciate it and see that in a way that's what I have benefited most. But I can't be corralled into some dreadful moment. But I mentioned the book Caring, and that made me aware that I was really caught up in sort of cycles of negative thinking what in survivor of suicide groups you hear is referred to as the terrible what ifs. You know, what if I'd done this? What if I'd done that? Why did I do that? And what I discovered is that, and what I was taught in these classes was that those sort of terrible what ifs that come in, or memories that blindside you, and the next thing you know, you're thinking. There's a difference, even though it's all sort of in your mind and thought. What first came into your mind might have been something you read in a book that just talked about the frailty of life and how certain people can't make it. It's not about you and your son. It's just an idea. And the next thing you know, you're thinking of your son and your own helplessness to done what you wished you could now have done. There's something else going on in the middle, which could be a pain in the gut or heaviness in your heart. And then the next thing you know, you're caught up in these cycles of negative emotions and the thoughts, the associations that come with them. And to slow that down, I sort of learned to do that a bit. That I don't have to leap from one to the other, even though they seem all to be woven from the same cloth of something's wrong here, something bad happened, something's not working in our world. Oh, and something's not working in my own life. There's an intermediate kind of path which you can slow down and breathe into, and so more than TSK, that's what I needed on a very sort of a body level, to be able to feel the response of my own body of unwelcome memories and ideas. I just sort of spread them apart a little bit.
In my own life, I've also found, while I was seeking out those foreign elements to stimulate my thinking, a lot of my growth really unfolded from those kinds of external eruptions into my life of loss and tragedy, and those things really shaped my course from pretty early on. I was initially doing those kinds of explorations through writing and testing the boundaries of my thought, but then there was a series of deaths in high school, losses of best friends, and multiple things that happened over a few years that really rattled and shook the whole superstructure of my life and made it want to fall apart. And it got me also in that pattern of just negative thinking. And the image I got of myself was like an ingrown toenail, just you know, turning into myself and inflaming myself with that kind of negative turn of thought and blame and anger and depression and despair and just existential why, and all of those things roiling together for a period of years. And I was just reminded in what you were sharing of something that not only something that was said in a recent episode in this series. One of the guests talked about how they reached a point in their life where they thought, I just can't go on. And then they had the insight that actually they just had gone on, that it still was unfolding. And that just a micro turn allowed them to sit differently, in where they were and what was going on for them. And at that point, when I was younger and I was going through those events, I didn't have it in myself to take that kind of distance, to even ask myself that kind of question, or to get that kind of insight. But I had an uncle who asked me at that point, I told him I can't go on. And I had actually already made a few half-hearted gestures in the direction of not continuing. And I told him I can't go on. And he told me, I totally understand that. And I want you to make a pact with me, and that is 1 year from today. If it's exactly like this and you can't go on, I will be with you as you end it. But don't do it now. Give it a year. Meet with me, and we'll see what happens. Right? And so that helped me, because it did go on and it did change. And what was fixed and locked did loosen. And impermanence is not only the loss of things going away, it's also the new always bubbling up, and you can't expect it, so there's that kind of grace that you were talking about. So I really appreciate that element. And from for the benefit of some of the listeners, to this episode, you mentioned caring, and I want to kind of just contextualize that's a book by Tarthang Tulku, and there were some classes organized around that. And so in what you shared, you were mentioning that TSK in some sense has provided some resources for you, and but there's a sense also that it failed at least the way that you held it, that it failed at a certain key point for you, and that there was something in the caring teachings that were what you needed. And I'm interested in that tension because TSK deliberately keeps certain things out of its scope. It's not devotional or centered around worship in any kind of way. It doesn't really. It has some teachings on love, but doesn't forward those teachings on love. I think that's in maybe the knowledge of time and space. He talks about knowledge, time, and space, but also about love. It might also be in
Love of Knowledge.
Love of Knowledge. It might be in that book that I'm remembering. But in any event, yeah, I'm interested in that, and that we can't expect maybe any teaching to do everything for us, but in its failing and our letting it go, we might also discover it to be more than we thought it was on the other side of that. Sounds like you were saying something like that.
I probably was inclined to think that I was inclined to think that my spiritual path, however I would have, whatever I would have attributed to in terms of spiritual teachings and influences, that it had failed me because something failed me. And I would say it took a while, I think very appropriately, to feel like I could benefit from time-based knowledge. My son was suffering a lot and very angry and resentful in the months leading up to his death. And I was taking a TSK class with Carolyn Pasternak at the time, and I think I did a little sobbing in the Zoom class, and so she became aware that I didn't know what to do with my life and my relationship to my son, and she said she offered to pray for all of us, the whole family. And then she died. She died a week after John did, but I really appreciated her prayers. And she could work with TSK in a way that is completely beyond me. She would lead us through giant body exercises, a whole series in the first TSK book, and going into the brain and going between tissues. And she just was like she was stepping around her backyard garden. And there was no sense of it being like, oh, let me try and imagine something. Oh, it's as dim as a elephant in a cloud here. I really can't. And she just sort of like, and I could go along with it. But, and I wrote in my journal at the time. And so I was studying TSK at the time and really sort of appreciating her as a teacher. But it was clear like the exercises she was leading us through at the time, I couldn't go back to them for a year just because I just assumed that they were bankrupt for me. That they talk about bringing light in, but they didn't, or not where I felt it mattered. So I think it's very natural at certain times in our life that what we need is another kind of focus, energy. And what I needed was the heart center. And when I first read the Caring book, I thought I read it all and just appreciated the writing and the sentiments. But I sort of thought, this is TSK life. I don't really need this because I've gone more deeply into the kind of things it's talking about, like needing to care and needing to be compassionate. Well, I started these nonprofits to help people with MS and ALS. I could sort of answer in that way. When they started offering classes after John died, I sort of recognized that I needed something like that. And then the whole book was sort of like transformed for me, both in painful ways and in ways that showed a path. In painful ways, it talked about how in our Western society we get trained in certain kind of a journey, and then we sort of make our own friends. We move away from home turf, and I would say I would just nod. First time I read, I would just nod to that. Yeah, I'd done that. But then when my son didn't do that, he never felt comfortable in the world. He never really got very many chosen intimates. These sort of phrases that I just could glance off me and say, I've done that. I've been there, I've done that. I realized that it's not true for all human beings, including my son who I loved. He didn't complete that sort of early path that we all sort of move on from and hardly remember later. And there are practices in the Caring book too. There was one where you write a love letter to the present moment, and another one in the first class, which is like caring for the self, where you look in a mirror and you say, I promise to care for you, body, mind, heart, and spirit. In one of the survivor of suicide groups, which I've been taking for the last 2 years and I'm now a facilitator in, I shared that I was doing that. And then I looked around the group, all the faces, and I said, I know that any of you, if you looked in the mirror, you would find somebody very worthy of your love. And everybody smiled. And one lady said, what are the exact words of that? I want to start doing that. And so one of the new things I've done is become involved in sort of survivor groups. And I finished this book about my own survival after John died. And if I think of something that there being a readership possibly for, I think of the people I'm meeting in these groups. Maybe some of them would like to hear about a path of the struggle and how grace came back, you know. But so when I think of why my relationship with this book, Caring, and the teachings of Caring, and my relationship with the TSK vision, it seems to me, in the same way that for a few months I saw some counselors after John died. You know, I needed someone to talk to, and someone who understood more widely than I did that this is something that happens to people in this world. They lose something. And my losses had all been, it seemed, psychological, you know, more than, I could always trace them to my own ability to deal with reality. But now something had happened that somebody had taken on the profession of trying to care for people who are wounded. I needed somebody, and then I feel I outgrew them all. You know, one was a neuropsychologist, and he saw John as having problems with his brain, but which was sort of in a way helpful, but doesn't help me to sort of grieve for him and hold him in my heart. I needed a heart-centered teaching, and probably every teaching has that in it. But if you're a head-centered person like me, you sort of gloss over it, and caring goes right to the heart of it, so to speak, of our need to care for ourselves and for others, and that's what I needed. I'm taking the third one now, caring for the mind. So we'll see what that does, if that's helpful. But I don't have the acute need I had in the first year or so to sort of contact parts of my being that I glossed over very easily. And I don't want to suggest that the TSK vision does that. That it sort of like it just speaks to part of our embodiment, and I think it talks to the heart just because it's not just our thinking, it's our feeling and our aspirations that get to feel more at home in the world when space opens up more and time is not so regimented into a sequence of moments, and knowledge is like a flowering of our cosmos with us in it. It's like the heart has plenty to rejoice at in that. Just I needed a more therapeutic intervention. So
Yeah, thank you for sharing all that. I'm sharing more from my side than I usually do, but I hope that's all right. I was listening to you talk about the mirror.
is.
What's that?
It certainly is, and I bet you there are a number of people who will really rejoice in that.
I was listening to you talk about the mirror exercise and just remembering myself. That was one of the things that turned me around at that darker period that I was describing before. Was I came back from a retreat. A friend's mother had seen the devastation wrought in me by all of the deaths and the family problems and things like that, and had offered to send me up to the mountains in California for a week to get out of the toxic atmosphere of my town. And up in those mountains, I had discovered this incredible living presence of the mountains and the trees and the sky that just cast into sharp relief that knot I had become. I felt like a chip in the clear glass of that pristine, radiant landscape. I felt that the way I showed up was a scar in that immense, spacious, scintillating presence of the mountainscape. And so that kind of like, do I want to be that scar? Is that, or do I want to listen to this, So that was like this initial prodding of me and my being to maybe to move towards healing. But when I came back from the retreat and I was in the bathroom in my house, I looked at my eyes and I could see they were utterly dead. There was just no spark in them. And I thought, I don't want them to be dead. And I just looked at the mirror until I could see the light, until I could see some kindling of caring, some kindling of life force. And that just became a practice every day until I could pull the eyes into a different mode of being. And so for me, that was a kind of caring practice like you were describing, and it really did help. to move out of that space. It's a very simple thing.
Wonderful.
Really did help to move out of that space.
Wonderful.
You know, in talking about, I really love what you said about how, you know, while you might think that TSK in its presentation doesn't deal with, so much the heart or the emotions, but when you really go into it, you find how much room it makes for the flowering of the heart and a way of being in the heart. So I really like how you describe that. But there's something about, the way things are presented and inhabited and digested and marinated and shared again. And, there's a way that much of the TSK material is presented as kind of a high philosophical teaching. And, in talking to a number of the people over this series, I've heard a number share how after a while, it doesn't necessarily show up as all these partitions anymore, but just a change in the mode of the whole gestalt of our experience. And I just wanted to say in some of your writings, which I talked to you before about that, but in some of your writings, I notice, even while you're talking about a time teaching or a space teaching in some of your fictionalized presentations, there's a real poignancy there. There's a real heart. There's a real poetic turn of phrase and a connection to characters and a connection to life that, I don't know, to me is a really special thing. So, I think we need more of that.
Yeah, it's like TSK deserves a song of praise.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, there's a way that you, in some of your writings that I've read, I haven't read everything, but I've read a lot of things that you've written. And I just notice, I think I just noticed that the way that you embody it and express it, even if maybe you are not feeling it because you're turning out a story, but to me, the way that it actually shows up is, it's a beautiful, grounded expression, that shows the, I don't know, the permeation of these kinds of teachings in the fabric of life and in the kinds of existential questions that we confront along the way. And, so I think, I hope to see the growth of a kind of a literature and art and other things around this that I think will help the vision be digested through more doorways of our being.
So I wonder if it takes somebody who's already kind of grateful for their own creative urges, or if the time-space knowledge vision can give birth to it. It certainly can, the kind of things you want to write about. Because I think the TSK vision is really fundamentally about what it's like to be a human being and what we all yearn for, what frustrates us and seems to withhold the realization of our dreams from us. And so, like, I find I even though I'm mostly writing little short pieces, I tend to do something that I perceive the TSK teachings to be doing. They start off by rubbing your nose in, and this is what you're experiencing in a way that you really can't deny. And this is the limitation of what's possible for you. And then you may have to wait a chapter or two, but then you have an alternative presented. It's sort of like a poetic, musically apprehended alternative to being so stuck. So when you talk about my poetic images, it's sort of like they tend to come at the end almost out of, because I don't want to end it on a negative note. And so then I allow myself to, and I always think my metaphors are kind of limited. I talk about the ocean and the mist blowing in and trying to reach toward a sense of a more open, spacious realm that's recognizable. And if you ever go to the beach, or you ever, like you were saying, you went up into the mountains and where you thought of yourself as a chip in the glass. I bet you now you would think more you're a voice in the choir of something natural in our world.
Mm.
So you're calling out attention to something that's precious to you. And so I maybe sometimes start doing that. I find myself doing that, trying to give witness to what's precious so clearly about life, but also with a sort of motivation that I feel it, and writing about it that I feel it, and reacquaint myself with something that's more musical and more, and sort of language become, I want to use words like spacious and open and bounded, but you don't use them so much. So you sort of look for something that's just what your heart says in the moment about something you're feeling or something you hope for. And that can be dark too. You hope that somebody you've lost is finally free without having any knowledge and without even trusting the knowledge. But there's a bardo separating death and life, or somewhat return to nature. I have no way of believing any of those, and I can't really put my trust in any of them. So I just like to keep touch with a sense of that our universe is friendly, and that it cares. There's some sort of greater caring for all of us. And I'm not remotely inclined to think there's a Christian God or even that there's reincarnation. I have sort of, I guess you could say I have no right to believe any of them because I haven't experienced them. But when you're hoping for something, when you're hoping for some more embracing realm in which we all live, and that would include somehow the border of this lifetime. And I have to say, in terms of, it's sort of like a time concern, I guess. I can't see before my birth, or I can't see after my death, and I don't really have any sort of convincing kind of report on it that I feel I have the right to believe, but just sort of, even if it's just wishful thinking, or even if it's just like a hope to look beyond that veil of what we can see, I'm more open to there being, I'm not quite as stuck in my own lifetime and the context of thoughts and feelings that my lifetime sort of introduces me to. I sort of look beyond the borders a little bit, just hoping that there's something there, something that's like that Longchen put title, kindly bent to ease us, that there is something kindly bent now and later.
Yeah. I think I feel that too. This growing sense of the okayness of things in a fundamental way. And, I was a little bit more formal. At least I didn't jump off into the personal as much in my conversation with Ken McKeon. But, he's also, to me, an artist that really taps into and finds a way to give really beautiful voice to a TSK sensibility without necessarily, naming the elements, but just showing it forth. And I just wanted to say that on the record here.
Yes, yes.
And I was thinking about, you talking about wanting to kind of write through something towards the appreciation of preciousness. And I feel that also. I remember being in writing programs where if you wrote a happy poem, they criticized you because it's not a meaningful or good poem unless it's tragic, right? And I always resisted that because I felt, yes, there can be light, saccharine poetry that skims over life and doesn't really do anything that's escapist, certainly. But there also can be, I think, a deeply affirmative form of art and poetry that does work in and through, the tragic and still appreciate. That's a very TSK thing to cultivate that deep sense of appreciation even through the woundedness and the loss. I have one story. I know we're getting close to our time, but since I've been a little bit indulgent in this one, I want to tell you this story, which I was in university and everything was going fine. And I woke up one morning very, very melancholy and could not place it. And I don't know if I've shared that with you before, but I woke up very melancholy and I could not place it, but I had a clear vision in my mind of these high grasses. And I was looking up through the grasses at a cloudy, drizzly sky. So it was like I was just looking up through the meadow grasses at the sky, and it was drizzly and overcast and gray and very depressing. And that mood was just sweeping over me. And I couldn't exercise it. In fact, I'd look at a white wall in my room and I could see that image there on the wall. It was that kind of intensely pouring through. And it went on for hours. And so I finally decided I needed to poetize it. So I sat down on my bed and I wrote that scene until it moved through towards a little light breaking through, lighting up the golden tips of the grass and some bees moving just gently in between them. And to me, just that movement of a little light breaking through and the liveliness of the bees helped kind of dissolve that for me. The next morning, I got a phone call that a relative was in the hospital and 600 miles away. And I got in the car and drove to them and met them in the hospital and found out that they had taken a bunch of sleeping pills the day before, wandered out in the rain in a field and had laid down to die. And were just looking up at the sky through the grasses and waiting to die. And they eventually went into unconsciousness and then awoke at night, not dead, and took themselves to the hospital. But for me, that was like, and so immediately on the spot, I recited that poem to them because whenever I write a poem, it just stays here. So we both ended up crying around that. But for me, there was like a moving through that process towards a resolution of a kind of liveliness and beauty there that to me didn't feel saccharine, but felt like it was right in that moment. And yeah, I hope, we can as a culture keep alive the sense that it's okay to say yes to life.
Yeah, that's a beautiful story. You clearly have a psychic ability there. And something spoke to you.
Yeah.
Yeah. You brought up Ken's poems. I read a lot of them and that he sends out to a few people. And I feel he often starts off with the pains of the body and the darkness of the smoke coming through from forest fires and the neglect of our culture, of our world. And then he works his way through where he's looking at a butterfly or a hummingbird in his garden, and so everything is resolved in the beauty of the world and his sort of coming back to it. And not all his poems, but it seems like at least half of them do that, which is maybe a bit like Rinpoche's writings before we would even be open to the possibility there's a more open space and a more lively, inviting time. We have to sort of go through a darker terrain of realizing that something's pretty wrong about the way our lives are unfolding and our society and the direction our society's heading. It's like you have to sort of like, you need both sort of the recognition of something needing to be redressed and a sort of reminder of that you really do wish that, and you are able to see a brighter, more caring realm that's just waiting for us to wake up and to enter in the dance.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, and I apologize. I have an envelope of time over me right now that my head's about to bump up against. I have a meeting I have to go to, but I've really just savored this conversation with you, and I thank you.
I thank you, Bruce, and it's probably a good time to stop because at a certain point I start repeating myself.
Great.